Hi John A. Jaguars. We are reading Soof by Sarah Weeks, and this is chapter 3, called More Than a Bell Loves to Ring. On Monday morning, Lindsay Toffel waltzed into class wearing a silver charm bracelet her grandmother had given her for her birthday. It was from some fancy schmancy jewelry store in New York City, and Lindsay couldn't stop bragging about how much it must have cost. During silent reading, she took the bracelet off and left it sitting on her desk while she went to use the bathroom. Couldn't resist, and picked it up. I wasn't planning to steal it. I only wanted to see the charms up close. There was a little seahorse, a wishbone, a cup and saucer, a heart with an arrow shot through it, a musical note, and a tiny silver bell, each one dangling like a dewdrop in a spider's web. "Who said you could touch that?" cried Lindsay as soon as she returned, snatching the bracelet away from me. Before she put it back on, she touched each one of the little charms to be sure that none was missing. Excuse me. Later, during recess, I noticed something shiny lying on the ground. When I bent down for a closer look, I discovered it was the little silver bell. It must have come loose and fallen off the chain somehow. Ever since my father had told me the story about Stevie Pritchard, I'd found myself wondering what it might feel like to have a friend besides Duck. Someone I could talk to, who would actually talk back. Maybe the silver bell would be my stick of Wrigley's gum. Maybe when I returned the charm to Lindsay, she would realize I wasn't so bad after all, and want to be my friend. Maybe we'd even be best friends by the time we started middle school in the fall. I was so excited I could hardly breathe. According to my mother, I had always been different from other kids. When I was a baby, I was sensitive to loud sounds and would scream and cover my ears in the grocery store every time they made an announcement over the PA system. My mother bought me the smallest pair of soundproof headphones she could find, and I would wear them when we went shopping or whenever she needed to run the blender or the vacuum. There were no other children my age in our neighborhood, so my mother would load up a bag with snacks and sand toys and drive me to a playground a few miles away. Being an only child, I wasn't used to being around other children, and I didn't like them very much. My mother watched me like a hawk. If I pushed some little girl who came too close to me in the sandbox, or growled at an older boy who was trying to rush me up the steps of the slide, she would rush over to intervene, explaining to anyone who would listen that I didn't mean any harm. I was sensitive about my personal space. I wasn't good at sharing and would pitch a fit if anyone tried to touch my things, kicking and flailing my arms. Eventually, people began to avoid us, pulling their children out of the sandbox or off the swings when they saw us coming. I was perfectly happy to play by myself. In fact, I preferred it, but it was hard for my mother. She stopped taking me to the playground and bought a swing set and a sandbox to put in our backyard instead. When I turned 5, my mother told my father she thought it would be best if I were homeschooled. After all, Heidi was homeschooled, and look how well she turned out, she argued. I would have liked nothing better than to stay home with my mother and Duck all day, but my father put his foot down. "She's never going to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet if you're always there to catch her before she falls," he told her. I didn't cry when my mother dropped me off on the first day of kindergarten, but the phone calls home began almost immediately. Not only had I bitten Lindsay Toffel during circle time, I was throwing temper tantrums at the drop of a hat. I was also a runner. Our house was a good 10 miles from school, but that didn't stop me from trying to get home. When things didn't go my way, I would take off running and never look back. I wasn't fast enough to outrun a grown-up, but I certainly winded a few. The minute someone spotted me, the cry would go up, "Aurora running!" A few minutes later, I'd be hauled back inside and marched down to the principal's office. I spent a lot of time in the principal's office that first year, and sitting on the timeout bench and talking to Mrs. Strawgate, the school counselor. She was the one who recommended that I be tested. "For what?" my father asked. "Rory's already reading chapter books and she's only 5. My mother reached over and squeezed his arm. "It can't hurt, Roy," she said. I was given an IQ test, along with a bunch of other tests, all of which I passed with flying colors. Well, looks to me like we've got a little genius on our hands, Rube, my father said proudly. She doesn't have a single friend, she told him. By the end of that year, I had stopped running and learned to control my temper, but the damage was already done. Liberty is a small town. There were only 15 kids in my grade, one of whom I'd bitten. Their minds were already made up about me. The following year, at a parent-teacher conferences, my first grade teacher, Mrs. Ratner, mentioned that I preferred to play by myself at recess, and that she'd noticed I touched my nose a lot and sometimes talked to myself. Later that evening, my mother told my father she'd made an appointment for me with a psychologist she'd found in Middletown. "You're not serious, are you, Rube?" my father asked. "She's just a kid." When my mother reached over and squeezed his arm, he knew there was no point in arguing. Dr. Harris's office smelled like a mix of salami and B.O. We played chutes and ladders while he asked me a lot of questions. "What's your favorite thing about school, Aurora?" "Coming home," I answered. "Well, what's your second favorite thing about school?" "The drinking fountain," I said. "Well, why's that?" Dr. Harris asked. A, the water is really cold, and B, if people push the button too hard, it squirts them in the face. And in case you're wondering, my third favorite thing is Henrietta, and my fourth is Gordon. "Are Henrietta and Gordon in your class?" asked Dr. Harris. I giggled. Henrietta was a bunny who lived in the principal's office, and Gordon was the custodian. "He's got a long pole with a tennis ball on the end of it for getting scuff marks off the floor," I explained. "He let me try it once. His favorite food is pimento cheese, and mine is waffles. What's yours?" "Black olives," Dr. Harris answered and jotted something down in his notebook. When we were finished, Dr. Harris invited my mother to join us in the office. "How did it go?" she asked, perching on the edge of the couch, her hands fluttering in her lap like a couple of nervous little birds. "Aurora is clearly very bright," Dr. Harris told my mother. "She is articulate and has a delightful sense of humor. But like many only children, I gather she's more comfortable around adults than children." "Do you think you can help her?" my mother asked. "Help me with what?" I objected. "I'm only 6 and I beat him at chutes and ladders twice." Dr. Harris laughed. "Therapy can be a long and involved process, Mrs. Franklin," he told my mother. "Aurora definitely marches to her own drum, but she seems quite happy to me." "Well, I'd be happier if Duck were here," I said, "except he might scooch his butt on your rug." "Aurora's teacher feels she tends to isolate from her peers," my mother explained, "and she has a number of unusual habits." "Yes, I noticed the tapping," said Dr. Harris. "Repetitive behaviors are a common response to stress." I was getting bored with the conversation. "Can I color in your O's?" I asked, pointing to a pile of magazines sitting on the corner of Dr. Harris's desk. He looked confused. "My what?" My mother opened her purse and took out a ballpoint pen. "Would you mind?" she asked, reaching for a copy of Psychology Today, sitting on the top of the pile. It might help keep her occupied while we finished talking. I lay down on the rug and got to work filling in the 3 glossy O's on the cover, while my mother finally mustered up the courage to ask the question that had been keeping her awake at night. "I used to work at a place in Liberty called Hilltop Home. Maybe you've heard of it," she began. "We saw a lot of autism and Asperger's, so I'm familiar with the signs, and I've often wondered, as we discussed on the phone, Aurora had significant developmental delays and she exhibits other telltale behaviors. Do you think it's possible she might be on the spectrum?" Dr. Harris said. "No, I don't." "Well, how can you be sure?" my mother asked. Her voice sounded shaky, as if she might be about to cry. "Her interaction with me was completely appropriate, Mrs. Franklin. She was engaged, made eye contact, had inflection in her voice." "Well, if it's not ASD, then what is it?" my mother said. "OCD? ADD? It has to be something." I looked up from my coloring. "Are you mad, Mom?" I asked. "'Cause you sound mad." "No, sweetie, I'm not mad, just frustrated." She turned back to Dr. Harris. "I want the very best for my daughter. Early intervention is key. You realize that without a diagnosis, she'll get no services whatsoever. People are in such a hurry these days to pin a label on anyone who doesn't quite fit the mold, he responded. Not everything has a name. I do, I said, putting the finishing touches on a nice round O I'd found in an advertisement for some pills. Aurora. My mother took me to see 2 more psychologists, plus an occupational therapist, all of whom came to the same conclusion. I was quirky, but not on the spectrum. I was also getting very good at playing chutes and ladders. Enough is enough, my father said when he saw the bills. No more testing, no more shrinks. She is who she is, Rube. Let it be. I had always been the center of my mother's attention. We were extremely close. She loved me with all her heart, and I was anxious to please her, even if it meant trying to make friends with someone who'd made it clear from the minute we met that she didn't like me. The reason I had bitten Lindsay Toffel way back when we were in kindergarten was because she told me I couldn't sit next to her on the rug because I was ugly. Now I was filled with hope as I hurried across the playground, clutching Lindsay's silver charm tightly in my hand. Lindsay and her friends were playing foursquare with a rubber ball in a chalked box, slicing the air with their palms to make the ball spin. If my plan worked, I could be bouncing that very same ball back and forth soon myself. What do you want? Lindsay asked when she noticed me standing there watching her, and suddenly I felt nervous. I just wanted to... I thought maybe you... I stammered. Maybe I what? Lindsay asked, slapping the ball so hard it bounced outside the line. No fair. I get a do-over. Aurora was distracting me. Lindsay, I said, stepping forward. What do you want? She snapped, spinning around on her heel to face me. Can't you see I'm busy? Well, I thought you'd like to know... I wanted to tell you... Tell me what? That you're a freak, she said, and then she crossed her eyes and tapped her nose with her finger 3 times. The nasty look on her face reminded me of that ugly old bullhead, only the whiskers were missing. Lindsay's friends had stopped playing and were watching us now, whispering to each other behind their hands and laughing. A small crowd began to gather. Like most bullies, Lindsay Toffel loved an audience. Hey, Aurora Franklin, she shouted at me. Why don't you show the whole world your flowered undies again? I knew I should walk away, but I couldn't. It was as if my feet had grown roots. I wanted to tell Lindsay that A, thanks to her I didn't wear flowered underwear anymore, and B, I hadn't meant for anyone to see them. We'd been in 2nd grade when it happened. I'd been fooling around the monkey bars by myself during recess one day. After hooking my knees over one of the bars, I'd let go with my hands, forgetting that I had on a dress. The next thing I knew, my dress was around my ears, and Lindsay Toffel was laughing her head off, telling everyone to come look at my underwear. Later that day, when I got home from school, I told my mother I needed some new underwear. I bought you 3 pairs last week, she said, yellow with pink roses. They're in your top drawer, sweetie. From now on, I only want white, I told her, and hurried off to my room before she could ask me why. Earth to Aurora, do you have something to say to me or not? Lindsay asked now, her eyes gleaming the way Thurman Hill's sea glass eyes must have looked the day Heidi showed up at Hilltop Home, asking him a million questions he didn't want to answer. I wanted to tell her that just because a person acts a little different or accidentally shows their underwear in the playground once doesn't mean they don't have feelings like everyone else. How would she feel if nobody ever wanted to play with her or sit next to her at lunch or had ever picked her even once to work with them on a school project? There were a lot of things I wanted to say, but the words got stuck in my throat, piling up until I felt as though I'd swallowed a mouthful of rocks. Well, said Lindsay. It was obvious this wasn't going to be my Wrigley's moment. Lindsay Toffel and I were not going to be friends, ever. Never mind, I said, slipping the silver bell into my pocket and walking away. End of chapter 3. See you next time.